Okay, so obviously today's workshop is on food systems and food sovereignty. So once again, I'm Bri Castilleja. Part of my job as the environmental education coordinator is to coordinate these workshops several times a year around our wetland. So we're going to start out with a land acknowledgement. So I know that people are tuning in like from various locations, mostly around Western Washington. And so we have this link. And if you haven't heard of this map, it's super cool. It shows you all the traditional territories of Indigenous people on multiple continents. And so for those of us that are in West Seattle, sorry, I'm running a bunch of programs on my computer that are too hard for it right now. Okay, so for those of us that are in West Seattle, you probably know that we're on traditional Duwamish territory, but we're also, so we're right here. So Duwamish, if we're on the Delridge side, we're also in Muckleshoot territory. And if you're more on the west side of Western Washington, you're in the Suquamish, all of which are Coast Salish territory. We do these land acknowledgements, not just to acknowledge that the Indigenous people were here before colonizers came, but they are still here and they're still struggling and they need a lot of help. And we should all do our part to be good stewards of the land and form like a reciprocal relationship with different cultures, especially those ones that were present before probably the most of our ancestors came. Yeah. Next up, so DNDA stands for Delridge Neighborhood Development Association, and we're also can be called Nature Consortium. There's a merger, so we're the same thing now. Our mission statement is to integrate arts, nature, and neighborhood to build and sustain a dynamic Delridge. Delridge is kind of a product of redlining in the 1970s in Seattle, so there's like a lot of food access issues, kind of a high crime rate, and just a lot of poverty. So for the nature side of things, which is the team that Caroline and I are on, we do urban forest restoration. We're restoring a wetland, and that wetland also serves as an outdoor education space for our super close nearby K-8 STEM school. Yeah, and so part of that wetland project also is these workshops. They used to be in person, maybe more fun, but maybe not. So this is the Delridge Wetland Park. It's our restoration site. It's the only wetland that we're restoring. And we acquired it from the city because it used to be a substation. So it's pretty cool that we have this piece of property that we got to take out all the development from, and we just like moved up in a classification for a wetland, which is super cool. I think that was last year. Like I mentioned, it's an outdoor education space, and in 2020, we put garden beds on it. And the idea at the beginning of 2020 was to create an enrichment program for students to be able to come out and learn how to garden. But then school and everything shut down. And so now it's been serving as a community garden space where all of the food production goes to our local co-op, which then gets redistributed to the residents of our affordable housing program, because we also do affordable housing. And so with the involvement of food production and gardening into our nature programs has sparked more of an interest in the food sovereignty movement. And that's part of the inspiration behind today. And there seems to be a really sharp uprising in the amount of garden programming that's happened over the last year. So I think that it speaks to a larger interest broadly. Okay, so what even is food sovereignty? That's a lot of people aren't super sure. And so this is kind of a long quote and I'll read it. You can read it too. It's kind of long. Food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. It puts aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies, rather than the demands of markets and corporations. And I got this from the first Global Forum on Food Sovereignty, which So it seemed pretty credible, and I feel like it speaks to a lot of the things that like I'm at least aware of within the food sovereignty movement. And so I feel like this like whole thing can really be boiled down to just like people over profits. So like prioritizing like health and our relationship to the land and like the ecological integrity and really just like relationship to each other and our food, which is why I think it's so cool. Okay, so the like main principles of food sovereignty are like food for people, but like sufficient, healthy, and culturally appropriate food as a right. So it's like their self-determination in choosing the foods that they eat, rather than being forced to eat at fast food or a corner store. It values food providers, so anybody who's involved in the process of growing, harvesting, and processing food is seen as important and valuable. It localizes the food systems, which is what I understand is primarily about creating and sustaining relationships between consumers and providers to make it more real rather than just based on profit. And it puts control locally. And the main point of that was like rejecting the privatization of natural resources, right? So like treating them, because currently we live in a system where everything is based on like money and value in that way. And so devaluing natural resources via capitalism and putting more on benefit on like the broader role that natural resources and natural systems can play in our lives. There's a big emphasis on valuing or on building knowledge and skills and valuing the sharing of local knowledge and skills. And then, so like traditional knowledge is like a huge one. And then working with nature. So nature is already producing a bunch of food. So how can we tap into that to increase and work with the productivity that's already here rather than degrading and destroying our natural land systems and ecosystems to create more food that maybe we don't need or really want. Okay, so food sovereignty for like everyone is the ideal, right? And I think that a lot of us know that disproportionately Black and brown and poor people deal with more health issues, and a lot of this can be linked to the quality of food that's available in their immediate environments. And so these principles of food sovereignty that I just talked about a little bit mirror so much of like traditional knowledge-based systems. And so the like driving question behind this workshop idea is like, how do we support and mobilize like all of our communities within this food sovereignty movement? And how do we like tap into this traditional knowledge-based system in a respectful way, especially for those of us that aren't Indigenous? And I think that DNDA's role in that is like wanting to understand and like provide access to everybody to be involved in this. So with that, I want to introduce our presenter. Her name is Yakaiyastai Gorman. She graduated from and now works at the Northwest Indian College up in Whatcom County. She is originally from Arizona and of the Navajo and Cheyenne tribes, and her like main passions are traditional herbal medicine, holistic healing, and food sovereignty. So with that, I'll give it to her.
Hi, everybody. And since we don't have like a huge group, I'd really like to kind of hear from each one of you, maybe like your name, where you're from, and then, yeah, a little bit about yourself. That would be nice.
My name is Caroline, and sorry, we're talking at the same time. And I am in Seattle, but I'm originally from Michigan, the Detroit area. And yeah, I've been working at DNDA for about 5 years now.
This is Shannon Woodard. Sorry, my camera's not on. I decided not to get dressed on the weekend. And I'm the board president for DNDA. I've been involved with the org for about 5 years as well. And I live right here in West Seattle. I'm looking forward to this webinar. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Shamika Gagne. I'm a descendant of the Purepecha and also Indigenous people from North and South America as well, Africa and Europe. I have been doing a lot of work with food and land restoration over at the Daybreak Cultural Center in collaboration with a couple different orgs, Na'alihi, United Indians of all tribes, and also parks. And so we're really excited to be here today, and I'm really grateful for you to be here and present, and thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Leah Rapley. I work at Food Lifeline, which is based in South Park in Seattle, and we work with partners across Western Washington. I'm in Queen Anne, and yeah, we've, we're a food bank with all of the pros and cons of sort of traditional food banks, and we're learning more and wanting to get more involved in food sovereignty. So excited to be here.
And maybe if you don't feel comfortable talking, you can just put some info about yourself and where you are in the chat.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to my presentation. And so a little bit about myself. I work at Northwest Indian College as a wellness advocate and science instructor. So a lot of my work has to do with Indigenous self-determination, sense of place, and teaching more about environmental science in Indigenous perspective. So that's kind of where my expertise comes into play. This presentation is on Indigenous food sovereignty. And you can see in the back is a cattail mat that is here to the Coast Salish tribes. Part of my work is to try and integrate more of a holistic view of Indigenous people, but not to where it erases Indigenous uniqueness, tribal uniqueness. So our overview today is just looking at building our foundation and what does that mean? Looking a little bit more at sense of place, and then coming from my tribe as an Indigenous woman, what Indigenous philosophies play a big part in food sovereignty. And then talk a little bit on negative impacts of food sovereignty, the health and wellness of the people, feeding our spirit and what that looks like, and then food sovereignty and our new vision. And this is just kind of a couple of pictures here of a house on the upper left built from cattail mats. And the reason that cattail mats are kind of like a well-renowned use in Coast Salish tribes is because it not only collects water just within the root, it also reflects water. So when they built their houses, it was to make sure that the inside was dry and the water kind of trickled off the top. And then here's a picture of a woman making a basket and some totem poles, and then traditional way of cooking and drying fish. So a little bit about myself. Yakaiyastai Nanabah Gorman-Etl. Bitaninishle, Adono Dana Kaidane Bashichin, Hashkanzo Deshicate, Woodich Nationale. Shema Doshaje, a Beverly Doe Emerson Gorman-Etl. Hello, my name is Yakaiyastai Gorman. I'm very honored and happy to meet you today. I am Navajo and Cheyenne from Arizona. My parents are Beverly and Emerson Gorman. I have a husband and 2 children. My clans are the Bitsich Bijni Bitahni, which is the descendant of Cheyenne under her cover clan. And then Noda'ana Kaidana'e is the Ute Mexican clan, and then Bitterwater and Hushgonzo. So when I'm looking at my clan systems and looking at building a foundation, part of my introducing myself comes from a way that I was taught as an Indigenous person, that when you introduce yourself, you're not only introducing you as an individual person, you're introducing yourself as somewhere where you come from. And so when you look at my clans, the Cheyenne under her cover clan, that has its own story of how I came to be. My mother's side, the first clan comes from your mother. So my mother's side, she is half Cheyenne. And then when she came into the Navajo tribe, they gave her the clan and adopting her under the Bitahni, which is under her cover clan. And here on the side, the left side, you can see a picture of myself and my sister. And so part of building my relationship is to kind of bring this openness of when was it I became aware of my sense of place. And I think that when I think of this to myself, it's in this moment right here. This picture was taken on the 3rd day of my puberty ceremony that we do for Indigenous people. Well, for Navajo people. And part of my growing up, I grew up in Arizona inside of a hogan dwelling and without running water, electricity. And so my foundation really plays a big part in my sense of place. And so when we're looking at sense of place, we're looking at who are you, who is your family, who is your community, and then what does that worldview do? And to that perspective, a lot of our seasons are very important to us. And when it comes to food sovereignty means that you have to have food all seasons around. And part of what comes with food sovereignty is the stories and the teachings behind how we get this sense of place and then onto our sense of purpose. And so at this time, I kind of want to invite you to take a look at your introduction. So as far as you, trace back, who you are, and then who your parents are, what community that you're in, and then what is your worldview, and how does that shape your sense of place? For myself in Indigenous philosophy and coming from a Dene woman, a lot of my worldview relies solely on this. And so these are Dene norms that we use, not only within our everyday life, but even within food sovereignty. So a big belief that we have is that the corn and the crop that we grow it speaks a lot to our relationality to it. The abundance amount of food that we bring or that we give to other people in order to be able to sustain life, which is our next one, Ina. And part of this goes into, how we take care of ourselves. And a part of wellness and taking care of ourselves and taking care of the land and it being a land stewardship means that we give gratitude, which is Sod. And in Dene belief, that means giving prayer or giving an offering and knowing how to connect to that. And it's not in a romanticized way, but it's more in a way where you're in touch with your self-awareness. And then lastly, Ajopa, kindness, which is speaking to reciprocity and having all 3 of these norms before kindness and how they work coherently with each other. So when you look at your relationships with people, and then you look at relationships with plants, are they the same? Do you see plants as another living thing? Or do you see plants as something that is a non-entity? And so when we're depicting philosophy in food sovereignty, those are the type of questions that I try to pry and make people, break that notion that relationality is not just to people. Relationality is connected to sense of place. either it be your community, either it be your environmental ecosystem that you live in, and then what sustains that life and what kind of gratitude do you give back to that place. So when we look at the philosophies of that, and a lot of these philosophies come with time immemorial, which come from creation stories and origin stories, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about history and, you know, why it is that we do the work that we do today as far as reclaiming food sovereignty and trying to get back to the natural food sources that we had. A lot of negative impacts that have happened came from broken treaties, you know, and this is not to say that like someone was wrong or right. It's more so looking at it in a place where we're looking at the history that has happened. So in 1850s, when it come to Coast Salish people and trying to make room for new people to come into this continent, Coast Salish people weren't able to fish or hunt in their territories. And part of the broken treaties and trying to, you know, find resolution between two people who had two separate belief systems, two separate languages, and trying to figure out how you're able to come together on a common term. And I think that we can all speak to that when it comes to relationships. If you've ever tried to have an argument and get your point across, and it's almost like that person doesn't speak your language. And in psychology, they call that either like love language or, you know, these types of languages within our body or with our words. They're very important. And when we look at the impacts that it has done on food systems, we can go right over to the Dakota Uprising. And part of my bringing up, you know, not just Coast Salish people within this area is that it happened all over, you know, the continent here in the United States. And so by the late summer of 1862, the Civil War was raging. And when we look at that war, the Dakota people had been starving. And part of what happened here was that they were so upset from not having a lot of food that they decided to do an uprising. And when it came to traders being able to trade with Dakota people, there was a trader who said, let them eat grass. And when I think about this concept as far as food sovereignty, and it's not very far-fetched from what's going on today. You know, just about a week ago, we look at what has been happening in Texas. There's a lot of people who don't have access to food, or they don't have access to their electricity to be able to make their food. And that's an example of an uprising, you know, bringing awareness to that area. And so when we look at history in this sense, these are things that are still happening today. And it's not just on Indigenous people, it's all of people. And so that's kind of why I wanted to bring that into this conversation. And then when you look at the pictures here, in the upper right-hand corner, that is a Duwamish woman in her traditional regalia. And then if you go just below that, this goes into 1864 of the Long Walk. And you can see that the Navajo people were taken from Fort Sumner, or from their original homelands all the way across to Bosque Redondo in New Mexico. And you can see that they have like the little sheep right next to it in the left picture. And so when we're looking at how food systems were impacted, a lot of these things come from what has happened, you know, and trying to do relocation and trying to put more people on reservations to make room for other people. And, you know, when we're looking at impacts of food systems, relocation is a big part of that. And then ration of commodity food. You can see that in the upper left, the ration foods that are in that area. They had butter, they had flour and things like that. And I really want to invite you into looking at not just the negative impacts, but also looking at what has come out of that. And I'm sure that all of you have heard about fry bread within Native communities and how that's kind of like a sensationalized Native food. And talking about fry bread, back then in these times, it was actually a struggle food. And for myself, thinking about the long walk, my grandma survived the long walk. And that's how I come to be here today. And so when I look at the negative impacts of food systems, it's not only to kind of remember my grandma and the story of how I came to be where I am in my sense of place, but it's also to remember that we don't want anybody else to go through these hardships, and we don't want anybody else to understand the amount of relocation that we have to do in order to survive. And then that brings me into wagon trails. So when we're looking at wagon trails and the effects on the ecosystem, here's a map of the Bozeman Trail. And so when we're looking at the Bozeman Trail, the wagons there, they created deep in-grooves into the earth that caused the sand to be more packed, and the roots weren't able to settle into those areas anymore. And this disrupted a lot of the ecosystems that were in the area and the natural migration route of either elk, deer, rabbits, everything, right? And when we look at like the impact that the expansion or even expansion that's happening today, do we think about migration routes very much? And that's one thing that I think about is like, we as people are finding convenient ways to make sure that we're in a more comfortable state, but we also don't think about the comfortable state of, let's say, like for me, I wake up in the morning and my desk is right by the window. I look outside and like I watch this little squirrel that comes running out of the little bush, and he goes and runs underneath the car. And as he's sitting there and he's watching these crows like eat out of the garbage can, then they fly off, and then he finally goes up there and he starts eating. And for myself, looking at the natural migration routes and thinking about that squirrel and thinking like, how is it that I can live here so comfortably and see a squirrel and I disrupted that migration route, you know? And so when we're thinking about food sovereignty, it's not just us, it's thinking about a world or an expanded worldview. Then going back to the slide here, natural indigenous territories. In these areas, there were natural indigenous territories. A lot of tribes in the plains and in the Southwest, and even here in the Pacific Northwest, they were all nomadic tribes that kind of integrated where they went during different seasons. And when we look at indigenous territories, as the migration routes changed and the buffalo started moving westward because of the Bozeman Trail, so did the people. The people had to follow their food source in order to survive. And that disrupted the natural indigenous territories of that place. And then when you look at the picture down on the left, this is a pile of buffalo skulls that was collected in the Midwest. And I'm not too sure if any of you know about the story behind this, but this pile is not only in recollection of a narrative that was told about indigenous people hunting too many buffalo and just leaving their carcasses because that doesn't align with our traditional values or our philosophies on life. When we're looking at this, a lot of these skulls came from the intent of genocide. And so when we look at how indigenous people survived with their food source as buffalo or as elk and deer, a lot of our traditional food sources were taken away from us, or they were almost led to extinction. And I think that that speaks a lot to where we are today when it comes to impacts of food systems. I want to bring it back here now to the Pacific Northwest and the work that I do here at Northwest Indian College and the research that I've done throughout my degree. here in the Pacific Northwest, I researched on E. coli and coliform. And I was mostly interested in what E. coli and coliform do in Whatcom creeks, and to measure how much E. coli and coliform was in the creeks going out into the Bellingham Bay. So the problem here is that our landscape has changed from Pacific lowland forest to agricultural land. And this didn't take just like overnight. It took a little while in order to be this way. But as we look at the corporations and how much food we eat within our daily diets, or even for all of our people in order to survive, part of it is that we have to have a lot of food in order to produce for everyone to eat. And so I wanted to look at what the impact was with cattle reservoirs and berry fields, and how that plays a big part in E. coli and coliform. And similar in Arizona, we have this problem too with E. coli and coliform. So the process is that the E. coli and coliform comes from cattle reservoirs and berry fields. And because of the E. coli from their eating and things like that, it leaks into the water systems that are right beside creeks. Why are farms right beside creeks? Well, a lot of it has to do with irrigation or self-sufficient farming that happens in those areas. And the water will leak back into the creeks and then into the Nooksack River that feeds into Bellingham Bay. And Bellingham Bay goes right beside Lummi Reservation, and this contaminates a lot of their tribal shellfish beds. The estuary that is right in this area solely relies on, the tribal shellfish beds being healthy, and with the contamination of E. coli and coliform, a lot of the tribal shellfish will filter out water, and they'll have coliform and E. coli within them. And not only do tribal people eat this as a tribal food for food sovereignty, but also people in Bellingham will eat these. And what comes of that is the pathogen-borne illnesses that are within tribal shellfish, the harmful algal blooms, and then the economic declination. So when we look at harmful algal blooms, the process of this is that the E. coli is going into the creeks, into the river, and out into the Bellingham Bay. And when we look at harmful algal blooms, in order to decay after they feasted on all of this E. coli and coliform, they sink to the bottom of the ocean. And when they sink to the bottom of the ocean, they need oxygen in order to decay. And when you think of big harmful algal blooms, then there's these dead spots within the ocean that have no oxygen. So no ecosystem can thrive in those areas. And then no fish can survive in those areas, and so like we look at this as the bigger problem, like how are we going to fix this? And how does this pertain to tribal food sources? And so looking at that and looking at the research that I've done, I compiled samples from two structured types of streams, so the open and riparian. So riparian is just places where there are trees over or debris within the water. And what I did was I did a filtration method that was developed by the EPA, and I determined the bacterial quantity, and I did a 1 to 10 dilution. What this means is just taking this little brown bottle at the bottom and taking maybe like 1 milligram or milliliter, and then putting it into saline water and diluting it. And then from there, putting it into the little Petri dishes here, the little white round dish, and letting them incubate for over 24 hours, and then bringing them out and looking at the bacterial quantity, and then counting each one of the E. coli and coliform. Here in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the coliform, and this is underneath the UV light. You can see kind of like the little specks in that area. And then I just entered the numbers into a database to kind of get an idea of how much E. coli in a dilution is within these water sources in creeks, and then kind of looking at the open and riparian zones to see if they differentiate as far as, does an open stream have a lot more E. coli or a lot more coliform in this area, or does a riparian have more E. coli and coliform in this area? So kind of doing like a comparison between the two. And then looking at these creeks here, and I wanted to kind of just give a visual. If you can look here in the upper left-hand corner, this is Pendon Creek. And Pendon Creek, a lot of these streams really smelled. And when I was doing the samples, you know, going into Pendon Creek, I kind of had to have a long little scooper in order to get the water, but also to not get a lot of debris. And when you affect the water, then the soil from the bottom kind of rises. And that's what you get within your filtration system. And so you can see that there's a lot of debris and like gunk from, you know, the E. coli that has built up in the area and the bacteria. Yeah, so these are the results. And when I was looking at how much E. coli was upstream and downstream, you can see that I have the top graph here showing a comparison of upstream and downstream within both of these rivers. So I seen that there was a strong correlation with E. coli in all of these areas, but more than that, I saw that there was a lot of coliform found within the riparian area. So a lot of like debris where water is slow moving and there's no sun, it collects a lot more bacteria, because I think it does. My theory on this was that the UV lights within the open streams are actually killing a lot more of the bacteria. But when you have shaded areas and slow moving water, you can kind of put two and two together of how like mold works, and then how E. coli would be able to get bigger. So, so health and wellness, why does this play a big part in health and wellness? When I think about health and wellness, and when it comes to our traditional philosophies and how we take care of ourselves, when we look at health and wellness on this level of like what is going into our food and what are the algal blooms doing to our health and wellness in this specific area, well, when you can't get the tribal foods and they're contaminated, a lot of times they'll resort to store-bought food, or they'll resort to fast food places. And Native Americans throughout the US have the highest diabetes rate than any other race or ethnicity. So you can see this graph here kind of showing a little bit about, you know, the statistics that have been happening with Native Americans. And when it comes to tribal food systems, I think that this could really help to lower the diabetes, the heart disease, the obesity, and certain cancers. So feeding our spirit, this kind of brings me into this place where when I'm reflecting and I'm thinking a lot about what it is that is important about tribal food sovereignty, or food sovereignty in general for everyone, Indigenous or non-Indigenous. Part of that means that as a non-Indigenous person, you get to really see what it means to recognize somebody as an Indigenous person. And for myself, growing up as an Indigenous woman and being able to be a part of my ceremonies, my songs and prayers, and these are all things that aren't accessible to just anybody. But when we do have open times where we can invite people, I really feel like these are places where, you know, a lot of us are trying to belong and trying to find our sense of place. And with that comes reclaiming food sovereignty and food security. And we all know like what happens when we're stressed. Stress comes from either not having enough food security, not having financial stability, all of these different things that play a big part in stress, and that causes cortisol levels to rise. That causes us to have like more of a high cholesterol food diet, or even starving ourselves or doing things like that, and it creates an unhealthy habit with food. If you can look at the picture in the back here, you can see that the different variations of corn, when it comes to revitalizing language and traditional foods, for myself, growing up, how I grew up, Navajo was my first language. And so when I went into school and everyone was speaking English, that was a very scary place for me because I didn't understand anybody. And I feel like I resonate with that so much when it comes to, you know, the impacts of food sovereignty when, you know, we were trying to communicate with non-Indigenous people. And I think that that speaks a lot to how we are today. If we can't understand each other and we can't find a common ground to be able to communicate, it really affects relationships. And from there, you know, we start assuming and we don't feel connected, and you know, a lot of things can happen within that spectrum. So part of this is learning Indigenous responsibility. Even if you're non-Indigenous, learning about Indigenous land ethic and why it's important to fight for these things. We're all in this together. And part of my philosophy comes from the perspective of what we call Nehokat Dene Dine, or Nehokat Dene Balashklagi. And what that means is five-fingered holy people. And the teaching that comes with that is that we are all human. There's no type of thing that separates us from either black, white, you know, any type of demographic of race. And so when we're looking at Indigenous responsibility, all of us are Indigenous to somewhere. Our big fight now is to find our sense of place, learn about native land ethic, and then learn about our philosophy model of how we can relate to these things and make it personal to us. And then healing multi-generational trauma. And that's not just speaking as an Indigenous person, but even non-Indigenous person. For myself, my biggest thing is to kind of like bring together this holistic feeling of like multi-generational trauma. Non-Indigenous people had trauma with like the narrative that was given to them about Indigenous people, and then vice versa, Indigenous people given a different narrative about non-Indigenous people. And so what did those narratives do as we grow where we are today? I think that we can all see that it has put us in a place where there is very little communication in between both, but a lot of assumption, right? And so I wanted to bring that back to feeding our spirit. And then with that, kind of taking a deep breath, I invite you guys to take a deep breath, just, and then part of, you know, feeding our spirit is to give thanks and to give a song. So at this time, with the corn in the back, I'd really like to sing you a song that I learned at my ceremony. So bear with me. Hung ay hung ay hi, hung ay hung ay hi. Ela she ay whistle, ela she ay whistle. Yahweh oh hey hey whistle hey 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 hey. Elashe yeah whistle, Elashe yeah whistle. Yahweh oh hey hey whistle hey hey hey. Elashe yeah whistle, Elashe yeah whistle. Yahweh oh hey hey whistle hey hey. So I'd really like to share that song as a part of this feeding your spirit, because that song is a song that was sung by a lot of women sitting in one room grinding corn together and being able to kind of find that balance with each other and leaning on each other and creating that sense of stability with one another, and then healing whatever it is that needed to be healing, working on your mental and your physical and emotional and spiritual being all as one. So I want to really invite you to kind of do these things and try to understand more and get connected to what it means to feed your spirit. And so going back into food sovereignty, various foods differentiate to different areas. And here in the Pacific Northwest, I put here the ferns, huckleberry, and then there's 5 different types of salmon species within this area. And then as far as elk and deer and things like that. And so what does that look like with food sovereignty as far as ethical food harvesting? Going back to the Indigenous philosophy model, ethical food harvesting means that you feel related to something, and then doing it with respect and doing it with that intention of reciprocity. And when we look at food sovereignty, a lot of our knowledge for Indigenous people, we look at our ancestors as specialized in agriculture. And what that does for us is that it brings us a lot of beautiful foods. And when we look at huckleberries, you know, I'm sure everyone here in the Pacific Northwest has tried like huckleberry ice cream or like a huckleberry smoothie. And for myself, you know, moving up here from Arizona, the food sovereignty is very different. There in Arizona, I ate a lot of like cacti and like things like that, yucca fruit. And coming up here, a lot of foods are very like luscious, like the huckleberry. And then a lot of that comes with generational knowledge. And it's such a beautiful like dynamic to kind of see how these various food sources work hand in hand with each other in creating such a beautiful diet for us. And then going into planting cycle, one of the things that I really like to think about is when we're thinking about planting cycles, especially in the work that when it comes to Indigenous food sovereignty or food sovereignty in general for everyone, I want to invite you to think about this next time that you're planting, the thought that you're putting into that plant and being able to connect to it, maybe the things that you want from that plant to nourish your body. And that's one thing that goes along with Indigenous philosophy, is that when you're cooking, it takes a lot of thought. And when you're cooking, you should be thinking about your family and what your family needs. Maybe that day was just such a hard day, but you want them to feel happy at the end of the day. And so a lot of thought goes into this. And it's not just, you know, a romanticized feeling of like, oh, I want to be connected, but more so like, how do you create that awareness on an everyday basis? So this kind of outlines the planting cycle, right? So when you're planting, you're putting thought into what you're doing. You're fully focused, you're present, and you have that intention for what you want. And then when you start to feed the plant, you start planning, like, where's this food gonna go? What is it gonna do? Who is going to be involved, you know? And then going into watering is action, and then that stimulates growth. And so being able to put something into action and being able to grow from it, those are all important parts of the planting cycle. And then harvesting. So when we're looking at harvesting, taking the food down or either doing like prescribed burns and things like that, getting ready for the next year, thinking about harvesting in a plan, or in a sense of reflection. And so when we're thinking about reflection, we're thinking more about like, what could I have done more in my thought process when I was planting? What could I have done when I was feeding? How can I like better do this in a way that's more ethical, or maybe like create more sustenance with, you know, what I'm doing. And not more in a capitalistic sense, but more in like a way where you're connected to people or connected to an ecosystem, right? So that's the difference between the planning portion and reflection portion, and then the watering and action. So what kind of actions could I have done a lot better? Or what did I do that was really good that I'll continue doing? It doesn't necessarily have to mean that you change a whole bunch of things within reflection, but it's more so giving yourself that time to pause and really put the three things into, putting the three things into your mind and being able to move forward. So our new vision. So when I was thinking about this presentation and thinking about like the vision that I wanted to come out of this presentation, I attended a lot of Indigenous food sovereignty things, and that's one of the classes that I'll be teaching next quarter. And so it'll incorporate a lot of these teachings, but more so at a slower pace to get more in depth with a lot of these key points that I shared with you today. This quote kind of stuck with me when I was looking at it with the International Indian Treaty Council. The right to food of Indigenous peoples is a collective right based on special spiritual relationship with Mother Earth, our lands and territories, environment, and natural resources that provide our traditional nutrition. When I think about that, I think a lot about how with our relationship with Mother Earth, I think that that is a very important part. And when I look at like our traditional philosophies of Diné people, a lot of our philosophies come from this understanding that the mother is important, and taking care of that female entity and being able to help renourish in those areas actually provides us better nutrition, right? And I think that speaks to a lot of moms today. Like when you feel like you've really taken care of yourself, or you done like the right self-care, that day you can make some really good food, or you can like really see the difference between like your children's smiles and how they are and things like that. And granted, it's not going to be like that every single day, but looking at this relationship with the Mother Earth as if you're looking at yourself, or even as a male, you know, if you see like your mom, or if you've like seen these different things, maybe it's something to work on, or, you know, it's something that you've never thought of before. So how can you help? I always think about this as far as people who ask me, like, how can I be like an ally or to do something that can make a difference? Well, I invite you to go over to ncia.org, and this partnerships with Indigenous food sovereignty across the United States. And they talk a lot about the agricultural sense of different areas, and they cover a lot of the laws and policies that change throughout time. And then here, I put another site for Food Sovereignty, International Indian Treaty Council. They talk a lot about food sovereignty, and there's a lot of opportunities throughout the United States that you can get involved in, or even just kind of like educate yourself on. Then I wanted to bring in the Pacific Northwest Salmon Center here in the Pacific Northwest, learn more about it. I know that there's a lot of different opportunities to be able to volunteer, as well as the NOAA fisheries. So I just want to say thank you for giving me this time, and I'm very honored to kind of share my perspective on food sovereignty, and I'm happy to answer any questions. These are just some references. And I just want to leave that open for everyone if you have any questions for me.
Thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, you can feel free to either unmute and ask, or put it in the chat and we can go through them.
Hi. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. The most productive use of a Saturday morning I've had in a while. I was wondering I'm curious what you're doing with the research you've done about the impact of farming on the shellfish. Like, I guess what conversations are there between the Lummi and farms in the area, if any, or are you involved in that?
The research that we did, we're kind of gradually looking at the algal blooms that are within Bellingham Bay. And that's a lot of the work that the Salish Research Institute is doing here at Northwest Union College. And so the research that I did was kind of just a small portion, but I passed it on to like up and coming interns that will kind of take up that work and then keep moving with it. So mine was just mostly like, I wonder how this is affecting this. And then that kind of started like the domino effect of like, oh, wow, this really is affecting the waters and things like that. And I think that there have been a lot of research done about that, but kind of seeing it on a tribal level and seeing how it impacts tribal people, it kind of rings more alarms, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing and from your, yeah, I just really feel grateful to be here today. And I wanted to know, are there any resources or ways to work? I work with a lot of middle school students, and we're starting to do more like high school students. And we're doing more project-based learning for Indigenous young people. And there's so much that you're sharing that I'm like, oh my God, this would be so incredible, just to like kind of bridge those labs and all the things that they're doing in high school. But that would be actually like incredible for their toolkits, especially with climate change. I was just wondering, is there anybody doing that kind of work? And are you interested in any of that? I don't know. I guess it's a longer conversation.
No, actually, the Northwest Union College does have student outreach to the local schools here in Whatcom County. And so they do a lot of like different outreach. Of course, since COVID, they don't really go out and meet each other in person. So they've been doing more of like small workshops like on Zoom and things like that. But as far as myself individually, my parents and I run a nonprofit organization for Preserve the Tradition, and it's under Pollen Circles Incorporated 501c3 in Arizona. And so specifically what we do is we teach K through 12th grade, or even 5 years old to 25 years of age, talking about like the specific impacts of like maybe how we can preserve the tradition, whether it be food sovereignty initiatives or language preservation, learning about archaeological sites in the areas that aren't like surveyed by the United States government, and how do we like keep those things from being protected and stuff like that. So we kind of cover a little bit more about that, but it definitely would be like a longer conversation, and I'm more than happy to do more presentations if need be.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's really great. I screenshotted or that's not the right word, your name. And so I'll try to find you. Yeah, I really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so the tribal community garden here in Lummi plays a big role in food sovereignty. Lummi House Tribal Indian Center here in Lummi does a tribal food garden program that they do. Like they invite people to come and like plant and do things like that, and then come back when harvesting seasons happen, or even come throughout the whole season, to be able to play a big part in food sovereignty. And then at Northwest Indian College, we started a moon and sun garden. So one with herbal foods, or not herbal foods, but like more of like medicinal foods that are within this region, and then one with specifically for food sovereignty that the Lummi people used to eat here. So yeah, does that answer your question?
I just want to mention that there's also, I'm not sure how active they are anymore, but the Muckleshoot Food Sovereignty Project with Valerie Segrest is pretty big also, if you're not familiar. And they're a bit closer to, yeah. So I think I have a question, if that's okay.
Okay.
What role do you think that food sovereignty plays in uplifting other cultures besides the Indigenous community?
I think that when sorry, my son's ready. I think that it plays a big part because, you know, not only are you trying to find a purpose in creating something sustainable for something beyond yourself, and a lot of like psychology has said that if you are responsible for something outside yourself and you're really passionate about it, you actually become more confident in your everyday life. And I think that like that speaks a lot to why it's important for other cultures to kind of look into tribal food sovereignty for themselves, or even try to get in touch with tribal or with food sovereignty in general, to kind of find their place there. And nutrition is such a big part. And I think that there has been a lot of controversy with healthy eating and like what is good and what isn't, you know, but when we go back to food sovereignty, that conversation doesn't like exist, you know. And a lot of like these things that come with diseases or heart conditions, cancers, you know, there's no real space for it when you go back to food sovereignty. So I think that's kind of like the initiative of why people should go back to learning.
Thanks.
And I feel like it really like helps too, because, you know, for myself, I grew up planting and harvesting my own foods. And on the Navajo reservation, we don't have food sources really close to us. And where I lived, it was like an hour and a half away in order to get to a grocery store. And so a lot of our food sources relied on what we planted for the summer. And so I learned how to plant corn, squash, beans, potatoes, and then kind of what things to make with those different recipes, whether it be soups or how to preserve them with salt or do things like that. And so a lot of my knowledge comes from my not being able to access foods. And that kind of brought me into this place where I was able to learn how to be more sustainable for myself. And then also look at like the food sources in that area. And I know like for myself, I grew up like eating yucca fruit, or end up eating like cactus and things like that. And they were kind of like snacks while I was running around on the mesa barefoot and like kind of hanging out with my siblings and stuff. But, you know, like those are memories that I have, and being able to kind of find yourself in that. And I feel that it really grounds you to either like your food, and you have more appreciation, and you kind of watch it grow yourself, and like the amount of effort that you're putting in there. And you can see like when you start slacking, and the food will like show you, or the plant will show you like, hey, you know. And so those types of things, it kind of keeps you disciplined too. Yeah.
Thanks. I have a plant over here that looks like it needs water, so I can definitely relate.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have another question.
Okay.
What has it been like the past year with the food sovereignty programs that you're involved with? What impact has the pandemic had? How have they helped, sort of create more resilient food sources? Yeah, so just curious what that's been like for you.
Yeah, so the 501c3 that my parents have, we kind of like did like small projects of showing kids how to plant and kind of like do like a small sustaining garden for themselves. And I feel like a lot of our grant money was kind of put towards resources of like water and then seeds and things like that to kind of help them start out the journey. And then a lot of research that we did so that we know how to teach them, and not just from, our own lived experiences. And I feel like that was really important for us this past year. And I live here in the Pacific Northwest, specifically on Lummi Reservation. And like I got seeds from my parents, and I did kind of like a small patio garden, and I did that with my boys and trying to like raise that initiative so that they know where their food comes from. So that's kind of what I do. And I have a lot of family and friends here in Lummi, so they kind of like give me fish, or they like help me learn how to do like crab and things like that. And I love it. I love the Pacific Northwest and kind of seeing like the salmon berries and stuff like that too. Yeah. But at Northwest Indian College, we didn't really do much as far as food sovereignty. For my work as a wellness advocate, we did do something along the lines of like maybe what we called stone soup, is just getting together a whole bunch of ingredients and making a soup for everybody and doing like a drive-through pickup stone soup, and then a talk about nutrition and health when you're at home. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. What's the 501c3 that your family?
So we're under Pollen Circles Incorporated.
Okay.
And then, but ours is specifically preserve the tradition. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Once we're done here, I will send up a follow-up email with, well, it'll eventually contain the recording of the workshop today, but also some information that Yakaiyastai has shared today with those links and such. So while we're thinking about questions, I just wanted to take a moment to drop this post survey in to the chat. It's super helpful for anybody who can fill it out for our grant reporting. So please do it. You don't have to answer all the questions, but just as many as you want, and I'll make sure to mention it at least one more time. Any more questions? If not, I think we'll just end early. That's okay with everyone. I looked up your.
There's a question. How can restoration play a role in food sovereignty? I guess it depends on different types of restoration. And I can speak specifically to Arizona and where my parents live. We did a lot of restoration projects on the area that my parents live. and it was because of like erosion control that has happened. We did a lot of erosion control because of the land that we normally will use to plant our crop and things like that. The water will just come rushing right through. And so trying to make like a irrigation route in order to help restore that area. So we did something in terms of that, but yeah. Does that answer your question?
This is Shannon. I have a question as well. I'm curious how, as a housing developer, an affordable housing developer on Indigenous land, what can we do to ensure that we are contributing to food sovereignty and also ensuring that we can still provide enough housing, and being mindful that we live and are developing in a food desert?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I've seen when I attended the Washington, Oregon sustainability conference is they were talking about sustainable food systems within like areas like that, like a city. And what they did was they did these little like, what are they called? Little like pipes that kind of house like water and soil to kind of grow their own food and things like that. But I know down in Arizona, there's a lot of developments of neighborhoods, and they'll do like a community garden in the middle of their facility. So maybe that might be something. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And I know that we do have a couple of community gardens. I'm wondering, the piping that you're talking about, like, is like a hydroponic system? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah. I've been wanting to do one of those for my house, but I haven't gotten the chance to. I feel like I gotta find time and set my intention. So yeah.
Thank you for your time answering that question and this whole webinar. It's been very informative.
Thank you. I have a 2-year-old and he doesn't operate on my clock, so yeah. Are there any more questions or even just any comments? They're welcome, or any critiques. I'm always open to critiques because I'm always open to doing better.
I'm going to put a link to pollen circles. I hope it's the right one.
Yeah.
I just want to, I know, I feel like I'm speaking a lot, but I just want to say thank you so much for your presentation. And also, I love the flow and the way that the art, and all of the information. I feel like we were able to really go deep in some ways, because a lot of times I feel like these webinars can be like these little, like, I don't know, just so on the surface. And I just really appreciate what you offered today, and thank you so much.
Yeah, I was talking to Bree and I was like, I think a lot of times we go into these kind of like stepping on eggshells and trying to like accommodate everyone, but really like we're all human, we all understand what has happened in history, and I think that serves a big part of telling the story of like how our work is important to trying to bring back food sovereignty, and then how we play a big part in that, and finding ourselves, and then finding out what our sense of place is here. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that, because when Yakaiyastai and I were talking, she expressed some hesitancy about going too deep, and I was like, no way, let's hit them with it, because that's kind of the goal for these workshops that I've been trying to do, is to deepen our understanding and get past that surface level. So I'm really glad that we could come together to create that today, and that was passed on to everyone who was here.
Yeah.
I'm just going to drop that link in the chat again for the post survey. But please feel free to keep asking questions. We have time. Lloyd, the link, I'll just post it again. It's in the chat. Can you see it?
Just in case, if you guys don't know, I actually operate a podcast as well. And so I kind of talk a little bit about like identity, ethics, and then norms that I kind of come to know. And then my vision is to kind of like help bridge that communication gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to kind of bring more of an understanding, like I did today, is to try and like see the middle ground and why both of our work is important, and how, you know, to see this work as not just one person trying to do this, but all of us, right? And trying to make that commitment to having more of a community. Yeah. I'm not too sure if you guys want to, but I'll link the podcast also.
I think I put it in the, because I was doing some internet digging this morning and I found it and it looked really amazing. And so I just put at least one link to it in the chat, but there's another one.
Okay. Yeah. So part of my goal is to help reconnect culture, and then also connect science too, in a sense. It's one of my main passions. I love science and I love Indigenous philosophies and things. So.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you to everyone who took the time to come here and learn from our wonderful presenter. I can't remember if I mentioned this earlier, but part of being on, we're on traditional Coast Salish territory, and that by choosing to engage in the culture in a very real way from someone or from any Indigenous person, and trying to put yourself into those shoes to learn the values and stuff, really paves the way for a lot of healing on both sides of a culture divide. So thank you. And if you have anything in particular you want to be included in the follow-up email, just put it in the chat and I'll make sure that it goes out. Is your son sewing?
No, I think that's somebody else. He's running around. I hear his little feet.
I bet my Aunt Christy's on here and she does a lot of sewing and she's unmuted, so I bet it's her.
I didn't mean to be unmuted, sorry.
It's okay.
Yes, it was me. I was listening though. It's wonderful. Thank you.
I do sewing as well, so.
I lived with my Aunt Christy, and it's funny because I would just hear that sound all the time.
And there was the same old sound.
Aunt Christy, Leah would like to know what you're sewing.
What I am sewing, just a quilt, nothing, quilts right now. That's my hibernation for the last year stuff.
Last year of hibernating.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I think we can close it out. Do you want to say anything?
I just want to say thank you, and I'm very honored to be here, and I really appreciate you guys taking time on your Saturday morning to kind of hang out with me and learn a bit more about food sovereignty, and then even from an Indigenous perspective about food sovereignty. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll upload, we have it recorded, so I need to download it and edit it, and then we'll distribute it out to you guys. So give me like a few days and you should get an email with a bunch of follow-up links and a link to the full presentation. No problem. Okay, thank you everybody. I'm going to close the meeting now. Bye.